In the years before the Pacific War exploded into open flames, Japan's naval leadership believed they understood America. Many of them had studied there, lived there, even admired parts of it. They had seen American cities, its factories, its railroads, and its wealth. Yet, in the final calculation, they convinced themselves that numbers on paper did not automatically translate into victory at sea. Japan's empire had risen with speed and precision. Victories over China and Russia had forged a belief that discipline, spirit, and decisive strikes could overcome larger enemies. By the late 1930s, this belief had hardened into doctrine. If war came with the United States, it would be short, violent, and resolved before American industry could fully awaken. Behind closed doors, however, some Japanese admirals were uneasy. They had run the numbers. They had examined production statistics, steel output, oil reserves, and shipyard capacity. The conclusion was uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. The United States possessed an industrial capacity that dwarfed Japan's, not by a small margin, but by a scale so vast it was difficult to truly grasp. In testimony given after the war, one senior Japanese admiral would state plainly that America's industrial power exceeded Japan's by nearly 10 times. At the time, that figure was known, whispered, and sometimes dismissed as irrelevant. The belief persisted that quality could overcome quantity, and that one perfectly executed blow could shatter American resolve. Pearl Harbor was conceived as that blow. Japan's naval planners believed that by crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet, they could secure a window of opportunity, 6 months, perhaps a year, during which Japan could consolidate its empire, fortify its perimeter, and force America into negotiations. The strategy was not built on long-term superiority. It was built on speed and shock. What was underestimated was not American courage, nor even American military skill. It was America's ability to build. In 1941, the United States was not yet a fully mobilized war economy. Factories still produced civilian goods. Shipyards worked at peacetime rhythms. But beneath the surface existed an industrial machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. When switched on, it did not merely accelerate, it transformed. Japanese intelligence reports before the war accurately described American production potential. The data was correct. The interpretation was flawed. Many in Tokyo believed that political division, labor unrest, and isolationist sentiment would slow American mobilization. They believed democracy itself would be an obstacle to rapid war production. They were wrong. When war came, the United States did not argue about whether to fight. It argued about how fast it could build. Within months, American factories were retooled at a staggering pace. Automobile plants began producing aircraft engines. Typewriter manufacturers turned out machine gun parts. Shipyards expanded overnight, employing thousands of workers who had never seen the ocean before. The scale of mobilization shocked even America's allies. Japanese naval officers stationed in the Pacific began noticing something alarming by early 1942. American losses, though heavy, were being replaced faster than expected. Destroyers lost 1 month seemed to be replaced the next. Aircraft carriers damaged returned to service with improvements. Air groups reappeared with newer aircraft and better trained pilots. At first, these signs were rationalized. America, it was said, was burning through its reserves. The pace could not be sustained. The Japanese Navy still believed that a decisive fleet engagement would break American power once and for all. Then came Midway. Midway was not simply a battlefield defeat. It was a strategic awakening. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost in a matter of hours. These were not easily replaceable assets. Each carrier represented years of construction, specialized labor, and trained aircrew. Japan's shipyards could not simply produce 4 new fleet carriers on demand. The industrial base did not exist to do so quickly, and even if hulls could be laid down, trained pilots and experienced deck crews could not be manufactured overnight. Across the ocean, America reacted differently. Instead of despair, Midway triggered expansion. New carrier designs were already on the drawing boards. Shipyards were expanded again. Production schedules were accelerated. What Japan lost at Midway, America planned to replace several times over. Japanese admirals began to realize that the war they were fighting was not the war they had planned. Reports filtering back from intelligence officers painted an increasingly grim picture. American steel output alone exceeded Japan's total industrial production. Oil flowed freely to American factories and fleets, while Japan rationed fuel to the point where training exercises were curtailed. An admiral later testified that Japan entered the war knowing it was outmatched industrially, but believing that courage, tactics, and initiative could compensate. What he did not anticipate was the speed at which America would convert raw capacity into combat power. By late 1942, the numbers became undeniable. American shipyards were launching vessels at a pace that defied pre-war assumptions. Liberty ships slid into the water in weeks, not months. Aircraft production surged into the tens of thousands. Entire air fleets appeared where none had existed before. Japanese officers watching from afar felt a growing sense of inevitability. The war was no longer about winning a decisive battle. It had become a race against time, and Japan was losing it. Even victories began to feel hollow. Each American ship sunk was replaced. Each aircraft destroyed was matched by dozens more rolling off assembly lines. Japanese pilots, once elite and irreplaceable, were being lost faster than they could be trained. America, by contrast, expanded training programs to industrial scale. One Japanese admiral would later say that the moment he understood the war was lost was not during a battle, but while reviewing production figures. He realized that even flawless tactics could not overcome an enemy who could replace losses endlessly. This was the reality Japan faced, even as its forces continued to fight with extraordinary determination. The industrial imbalance was not just numerical, it was structural. America could afford mistakes. Japan could not. America could experiment, improve, and iterate. Japan was forced to conserve, to delay, and to improvise with dwindling resources. As the war progressed, this imbalance widened into a chasm. What Japan had believed would be a short war became a grinding contest of production and attrition, exactly the kind of war its admirals had feared and warned against. The 6 months of freedom of action predicted by Yamamoto passed quickly. Then another 6 months. Then another year. By the time Japanese leaders openly acknowledged the scale of American industrial dominance, there was no path to reverse it. The war had become unstoppable, not because of a single weapon or strategy, but because of factories, shipyards, and assembly lines operating day and night across an entire continent. And this was only the beginning. By the early years of the Pacific War, many senior Japanese naval officers already understood something the public did not. Victory would not be decided by bravery, tactics, or even early success. It would be decided by factories, steel, oil, and time. Japan's admirals had studied the United States for decades. Some had lived there. Some had attended American universities. Others had served as naval attaches in Washington. They had seen American cities stretching endlessly, factories operating day and night, railroads carrying raw materials across an entire continent. One of these men would later testify, under oath, after the war had ended. He said plainly, the United States possessed at least 10 times Japan's industrial capacity. And because of that, Japan never truly stood a chance. Before Pearl Harbor, before Midway, before the long island-hopping campaigns, Japan's Navy faced a fundamental contradiction. It had some of the world's finest ships and pilots, but no way to replace them at the speed modern war demanded. Japan could build a battleship with exquisite craftsmanship. The Yamato itself was proof of that. But each ship took years, immense resources, and highly skilled labor. America, by contrast, built ships the way it built automobiles. Standardized parts, assembly lines, massive workforces trained quickly and efficiently. When war began, Japan hoped for a short, decisive conflict. The plan was simple. Strike hard. Cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet. force Washington to negotiate before American industry could fully mobilize. This strategy was not born from arrogance. It was born from fear. Japanese planners knew that if the war dragged on, the numbers would become impossible to overcome. Every month that passed would tilt the balance further toward the United States. American shipyards had already begun expanding even before Pearl Harbor. Once the U.S. formally entered the war, production exploded at a scale never seen before in human history. Aircraft factories multiplied. Shipyards appeared along rivers, coasts, and inland waterways. Workers poured in from every state, including women and minorities who had never before been part of industrial labor at such scale. Meanwhile, Japan struggled with shortages. Oil had to be imported across long sea routes vulnerable to attack. Steel production was limited. Transportation infrastructure was fragile. Every loss hurt Japan far more than it hurt America. A Japanese carrier sunk could not be easily replaced. A veteran pilot killed meant years of training gone forever. Japan's training system emphasized perfection over volume. America emphasized speed and replacement. This difference would prove fatal. By 1942, Japan still believed it could win by striking one more decisive blow. One battle. One crushing victory that would shatter American morale. But beneath that hope lay the quiet understanding shared by senior officers. Time was not on their side. Later, during post-war interrogations, one Japanese admiral explained it with brutal honesty. He said that even if Japan won every major naval battle for 6 months, the United States would still outproduce Japan by a staggering margin. America could lose ships and replace them faster than Japan could repair damage. That realization haunted Japan's leadership. They were not ignorant. They were desperate. The war, from their perspective, was a race against a factory system that had no historical equal. Every American carrier laid down, every bomber rolling off an assembly line, every convoy crossing the Pacific widened the gap. By the time Japanese civilians were told of early victories, the men at the top already feared the ending. They knew the truth. Industrial capacity decides modern war. And America had more of it than the rest of the world combined. By the time Japanese planners began to fully grasp the scale of American industrial power, the war had already taken on a momentum that could no longer be reversed. What initially appeared to be a distant, sluggish giant was revealing itself as something entirely different. A nation capable of converting civilian factories into engines of war at a speed the world had never witnessed before. Inside Japan's naval and military circles, early intelligence reports about American production were often dismissed or softened. Officers preferred optimistic interpretations. They told themselves that Americans lacked discipline, that their workers were spoiled, that democracy slowed decision-making. These assumptions had been comforting before the war. Now, they were becoming dangerous illusions. Japanese attaches stationed in neutral countries began sending back alarming data. American shipyards were launching vessels in weeks, not months. Aircraft plants were operating around the clock. Entire towns were being built solely to support war production. At first, these reports were treated as exaggerations. But as months passed, the numbers kept climbing, and they all pointed in the same direction. The Japanese economy, already strained by limited natural resources, could not expand in the same way. Steel, oil, aluminum, and fuel were precious. Every ship lost, every aircraft destroyed, represented months of effort that could not easily be replaced. In contrast, American losses were being replenished almost as fast as they occurred. Senior Japanese admirals began privately acknowledging a grim truth. This was no longer a war of tactics or bravery alone. It was a war of arithmetic. And in arithmetic, the United States was unbeatable. One naval officer later recalled sitting in a briefing room, watching production charts projected onto a wall. The American lines rose sharply upward. Japan's remained flat, even declining. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The war's outcome was written not in strategy papers, but in factory output. The realization did not come all at once. It crept in quietly, eroding confidence bit by bit. After each major battle, American strength seemed not diminished, but reinforced. New carriers appeared. New aircraft models replaced old ones. Pilots who had been shot down were replaced by fresh squadrons trained in massive programs back home. Japanese commanders who had once believed that a decisive early blow would force America to negotiate now understood the fatal flaw in that thinking. America did not fight like an empire defending distant colonies. It fought like an industrial civilization, mobilizing its entire population. Behind every American warship was a supply chain stretching across a continent. Behind every bomber was a factory employing thousands. Behind every pilot was a training system producing replacements faster than enemies could eliminate them. Japan simply did not have equivalents on that scale. Even so, publicly admitting this reality was impossible. The Japanese military culture valued resolve and sacrifice. To speak openly of inevitable defeat would have been seen as disloyalty. And so the war continued, driven forward by momentum, pride, and the hope that somehow the numbers might stop growing. But the numbers never stopped. As 1943 progressed, American production figures became staggering. The United States was not just matching the combined output of its enemies, it was surpassing them. This was the moment when many Japanese leaders privately conceded that the war was lost, even as they publicly prepared for further battles. In later testimonies, some Japanese admirals would admit that they had understood the truth years before the surrender. Once America's industrial machine was fully engaged, Japan never stood a chance. The only unknown was how long the nation could endure before collapse. And yet, despite this knowledge, the fighting continued. Because wars are not ended by realization alone. They are ended by events. And those events were still unfolding, one devastating battle at a time. By the time the Pacific War entered its second full year, the illusion of parity had already shattered inside Japan's senior command. On paper, the Imperial Navy still possessed skilled crews, hardened pilots, and a tradition that reached back centuries. But beneath the surface, a realization was spreading quietly and painfully. The war was no longer being decided by courage or tactics alone. It was being decided by factories, steel, fuel, and time. Japanese admirals who had once planned Pearl Harbor now found themselves reading intelligence reports that told a far more dangerous story. American shipyards were launching vessels at a rate Japan could not comprehend. New carriers appeared on reconnaissance maps faster than planners could revise their estimates. Where Japan replaced a ship in months, America replaced one in weeks. Where Japan trained pilots carefully over years, America trained thousands simultaneously. Captured documents, intercepted communications, and post-battle analysis all pointed toward the same conclusion. The United States was not fighting as a nation strained by war. It was fighting as a continent fully mobilized. One Japanese admiral would later testify that the United States possessed at least 10 times Japan's industrial capacity. At the time, that number sounded unbelievable, even exaggerated. But battle after battle confirmed it. Every American loss was followed not by retreat, but by replacement, faster, larger, and improved. After Midway, Japanese dockyards worked day and night, trying to repair damaged carriers and cruisers. Skilled labor was scarce. Raw materials were scarcer. Fuel shipments were constantly threatened. Meanwhile, American carriers appeared with new radar systems, better anti-aircraft guns, and aircraft that outperformed their predecessors. Japanese planners had hoped for a decisive early victory, a single crushing blow that would force America to negotiate. That hope died, not in one battle, but in the months that followed, as reality set in. America was not slowing down. It was accelerating. The Guadalcanal campaign became the clearest demonstration of this imbalance. Japanese ships fought bravely in night actions, often outperforming their opponents tactically. Yet, every Japanese victory came at a cost that could not be replaced. Every American loss was absorbed, repaired, or replaced almost immediately. Behind closed doors, senior officers began to speak openly. something unthinkable earlier in the war. The United States, they admitted, was not merely stronger. It was structurally unstoppable. American aircraft production reached numbers that defied logic. Bombers rolled off assembly lines in hours. Fighters were delivered by the thousands. Engines, spare parts, ammunition, all flowed across oceans as if distance no longer mattered. Japan, by contrast, fought a war chained to limited resources. Aluminum shortages reduced aircraft output. Fuel shortages grounded pilots. Training hours were cut. Veteran airmen were lost and could not be replaced at the same level of skill. The imbalance showed itself in the skies first. Japanese pilots who had once dominated early encounters now faced swarms of American aircraft. Losses mounted. Survivors spoke of endless formations that seemed to stretch to the horizon. At sea, the pattern repeated. American task forces returned again and again, even after suffering damage. Japanese fleets returned fewer each time. The Admiral, who would later testify about America's industrial superiority, did not speak in anger or bitterness. His words carried resignation. He understood that no strategy could overcome a tenfold difference in production. No amount of bravery could compensate for a factory that never slept. Even if Japan won battles, America would win the war simply by building more of everything. By late 1943, this realization was no longer theoretical. It was visible in every engagement. American logistics chains spanned the Pacific. Floating dry docks repaired ships near the front. New airfields appeared on captured islands almost overnight. Japan fought on, but now with the knowledge that time itself had become the enemy. The war was no longer about who would win. It was about how long defeat could be delayed. And in the quiet moments between battles, Japanese commanders understood the truth that history would later confirm. The outcome had been decided not by guns or generals, but by factories, assembly lines, and an industrial power Japan could never hope to match. By the time the war entered its final years, Japanese naval officers were no longer debating tactics or courage. They were confronting arithmetic, cold, unforgiving numbers, the kind of numbers that decide wars long before the first shot is fired. One senior Japanese admiral would later testify that the United States possessed nearly 10 times Japan's industrial capacity, and once that reality became clear, the outcome was no longer in doubt. This was not an emotional realization. It was a professional one. In the early stages of the Pacific War, Japan had relied on speed, precision, and surprise. Pearl Harbor, the rapid expansion across Southeast Asia, and early naval victories gave the impression that Japan could dictate the pace of the conflict. But beneath those victories lay a dangerous assumption that America lacked the will or the ability to fully mobilize its economy for a prolonged war across an ocean. That assumption collapsed as factories, shipyards, and assembly lines across the United States shifted into wartime production. Japanese intelligence officers began reporting figures that were almost impossible to comprehend. American shipyards were launching carriers faster than Japan could repair damaged ones. Aircraft factories were producing planes in quantities that exceeded Japan's total annual output in mere months. Even when Japanese forces achieved tactical successes, they noticed something unsettling. The enemy returned stronger, better supplied, and in greater numbers every time. Admirals and planners gathered in briefing rooms filled with maps and charts, but increasingly those charts showed production tables instead of battle plans. Steel output, oil reserves, aircraft engines per month, cargo tonnage delivered across the Pacific. The United States was not just fighting Japan, it was outbuilding, outshipping, and outproducing it on a scale no empire could match. One Japanese naval officer later recalled that it felt like fighting a country that regenerated its losses instantly. Sink an American ship, and 2 more appear months later. Shoot down a bomber, and 10 more arrive the following week. Japanese pilots began encountering newer American aircraft flown by increasingly well-trained crews, while Japan struggled to replace experienced airmen lost earlier in the war. By 1944, Japan's situation had become desperate. Fuel shortages grounded ships and aircraft. Training hours were cut to conserve resources. Ships remained in port not because commanders feared battle, but because there was no fuel to reach it. Meanwhile, American fleets roamed freely, protected by overwhelming air cover and sustained by a logistical system that never stopped moving. The industrial imbalance was no longer theoretical. It was visible in the skies filled with American bombers, in the seas dominated by American task forces, and in the endless convoys stretching from the U.S. mainland to forward bases across the Pacific. Japanese admirals understood that bravery could not substitute for factories, and strategy could not overcome a 10-1 production gap. In post-war testimony, Japanese leaders spoke with remarkable clarity. They did not blame soldiers or sailors. They did not even blame tactics. They pointed to industry, to raw material access, to assembly lines that ran day and night. The war, they admitted, was lost not at Midway, not at Leyte Gulf, but the moment Japan chose to fight a nation whose economic output dwarfed its own beyond any possibility of recovery. The realization was sobering. Japan had entered the war hoping for a short, decisive conflict that would force negotiation. Instead, it found itself locked in a war of production against a country uniquely suited to wage one. Once American industry reached full momentum, there was no strategic maneuver left that could change the balance. For Japan's admirals, the conclusion was unavoidable. Against an enemy with 10 times the industrial capacity, the war was not merely difficult, it was unwinnable. And as American forces continued to advance, that mathematical truth became the silent verdict hanging over every remaining decision. By the time the war entered its final phase, the conclusion that Japanese leaders had once refused to acknowledge was no longer avoidable. What had begun as a calculated gamble against a supposedly slow, divided American nation had transformed into a crushing lesson in industrial reality. The testimony of Japan's admirals after the war was not an attempt to excuse failure. It was an admission of mathematics, steel, and time. American shipyards no longer worked in bursts of urgency. They operated like machines themselves. Liberty ships slid into the water in days, not months. Aircraft factories produced bombers faster than frontline units could absorb them. Fuel, ammunition, trucks, radios, food, everything arrived in quantities that Japanese planners had never imagined possible. Even when Japan fought well tactically, even when individual battles were contested fiercely, the outcome was already decided far beyond the battlefield. Japanese officers watched American carrier task forces regenerate after losses that would have crippled Japan permanently. Pilots trained for years were replaced by American airmen trained in months, yet backed by overwhelming logistics and fuel supplies. Each American loss was temporary. Each Japanese loss was final. The admiral who testified after the war spoke without bitterness. He stated plainly that Japan never possessed the industrial base to sustain a long war against the United States. At best, Japan could shock, delay, and hope. But hope was not a strategy, and against 10 times the industrial capacity, hope evaporated quickly. The skies over Japan in 1944 and 1945 told the final story. Hundreds of bombers appeared where dozens once flew. Factories burned faster than they could be repaired. Shipping lanes collapsed. Fuel ran dry. Aircraft sat idle not for lack of pilots, but for lack of gasoline. The war was no longer about courage or skill. It was about arithmetic. American industry had not merely supplied a war. It had become the war. Every American worker, every factory shift, every rail shipment translated directly into pressure at the front. Japanese leaders who once dismissed America as decadent now understood that they had misread the nation entirely. What they mistook for softness was scale. What they underestimated was endurance. In his final reflections, the admiral admitted that the war had been lost not at Midway, not at Leyte Gulf, not even in the firebombed ruins of Tokyo, but at the moment Japan chose to challenge a nation whose factories could outbuild defeat itself. The outcome was written in steel long before it was written in blood. History would later remember this conflict not only as a clash of armies and fleets, but as a demonstration of industrial power unmatched in human history. And in that contest, Japan never stood a chance. Not because it lacked bravery, but because it lacked time, resources, and the capacity to replace what war inevitably consumes. The lesson, etched in a post-war testimony, was brutally simple. Modern war is won long before the first shot is fired. It is won in factories, shipyards, and supply lines. And once that reality became clear, even Japan's most senior admirals knew the truth. They had fought a war that could not be won.